So you've done the work. You named the wound, you sat in it long enough to understand what it actually was. You stopped calling isolation healing. You learned the difference between community and belonging. You identified the consumer posture in yourself, and you are ready, or at least you think you're ready, to try again. And now you're standing on the edge of it. A new church, a new small group, a new discipleship group, a new community of people who seem genuine and warm and like they might actually be different. And you cannot make yourself walk through the door. But it's not because you don't want what's on the other side. You want it more than you've wanted almost anything, but the last time you walked through a door like this one, it cost you something that you weren't sure that you could afford to lose. And the time before that, and the time before that. And so you stand there, ready and terrified at the same time, wanting to believe and not quite sure that you still can. This episode is for you. But it's not to push you through the door before you're ready. Rather, it's to make sure that when you walk through it, you walk through it differently than you have before. Welcome to Faith Formed. I'm your host, Justin, and this is the podcast about honest faith for people who don't have it all together. And this is episode 33, and it's also the final part of the belonging arc. We started in episode 31 by naming the wound, sitting in the reality of church hurt without rushing it. In episode 32, we made the distinction between community and belonging, and we named the consumer posture that keeps so many sincere believers cycling through communities and leaving empty. And if you haven't heard any of those episodes, I'd invite you to pause this one and go back, because this one builds on everything that we've done over the last 2 weeks. And today we're closing the arc. But it's not going to be with a neat resolution because not a lot of things in life are neat. But it's because re-entry into community is not a neat thing. It never has been. But I really wanted to close this episode with something that was honest and practical, and something that I hope sends you somewhere. And so the question we're asking today is not, should you try again? I think most of you already know the answer to that. But the question is, how should you try again? How do you re-enter community with wisdom after it's already cost you something? How do you stay open without being naive? How do you build something real in the middle of imperfect people who will, at some point, disappoint you again? So that's where we're going. And I pray that this episode blesses you. And if you're enjoying what we are putting out weekly, we would love for you to leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, the first thing I want to name before we go any further is a distinction that I think gets skipped over in most conversations about returning to community. See, there's a difference between a naive reentry and a wise reentry. Naive reentry looks like this. You've been hurt, you've healed enough to feel hopeful, and you walk into a new community with the same posture that you had before the wound. You're open, you're trusting, expecting the best, giving yourself fully before you've had any evidence that it's safe to do so. And I'm not condemning that posture at all. I think there is something beautiful about the willingness to try again without armor, to just lay yourself bare and to just go for it and see what happens. But naive re-entry almost always produces the same outcome. A wound that confirms the fear that you've been carrying. A retreat that's harder to come back from than the last time this happened. But wise re-entry looks different. It's still open, okay? It's still willing. It's still hoping for the real thing, but it also brings something that I don't think naive re-entry carries. Discernment. And discernment is not the same thing as suspicion. If you are out in the cultural streets and you hear people talking about discernment, they're almost always talking about discernment after something's already happened. That's not discernment. But discernment is also not suspicion, because suspicion assumes the worst and looks for evidence to confirm it. Discernment simply pays attention. And in this case, it's paying attention to what a community values and how it handles failure, to whether the people in it are actually being formed or just performing formation. Scott McKnight, he is a big voice in his studies and work on church culture, but he argues that the health of a community is most visible not in its best moments, but in how it responds to its worst ones. For example, how does a community handle a leader who falls? What happens when someone raises a hard question? What is the culture around failure and confession? Or is vulnerability welcomed or managed? See, those are questions that wise re-entry asks before it gives itself over fully. And asking them is not a lack of faith. If anybody's ever told you that, no. It's not a lack of faith. I think it is faithfulness to the discernment that God has given you. And it's a discernment that was purchased at a real cost. And I want to take us to a text that I think speaks directly to this moment. And that's going to be in Ruth chapter 1. Most people know the story of Ruth, okay? But I want to focus on Naomi, because Naomi is the person in the story who has been through the fire and is now finding her way back. Naomi left Bethlehem with her husband and 2 sons during a famine. While she was away, her husband died. Then her sons married Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, and then both sons died. Just all the tragedy on top of the tragedy. And so now you have Naomi that's left in a foreign land without a husband, without sons, without the social and economic protections that come with them. She's completely exposed. And so she decides to go home to Bethlehem, back to her people, back to the community that she had left years before. But I want you to notice something about how she re-enters, okay? She didn't perform. She didn't manage how she was received. She didn't walk into Bethlehem with the polished version of her story. When the women of Bethlehem saw her and said, "Is this Naomi?" she answered them with everything that she was carrying. She said, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." And that's verses 20 and 21 of Ruth chapter 1. I think that is about as honest a re-entry statement as you'll find in all of Scripture, because she didn't arrive pretending to be okay. She didn't minimize her loss to make her re-entry easier for the people that she was re-entering with. She walked back into her community and told the truth of her experience and what the years had cost her. And I want you to notice that her community received her. Naomi's honesty wasn't a liability. It was the thing that made real belonging possible. Because she refused to perform, there was nothing between her and the people she was returning to. There was no managed version. There was no pretense. Just a real woman, carrying the real weight and asking for the real thing from the people around her. And I think that is the posture of a wise reentry. It's not naive. It's not armored. It's just honest. And when we have conversations about what it's like to re-enter into community, most of these conversations will focus solely around what you're looking for. The right environment, a fire kids ministry, a fire worship team, theologically sound worship, or the big thing now, Folks are looking for churches. They're like, oh, I want a church that gives the meat. I want a pastor who preaches expository preaching. I don't need the themes, and I don't need all this. Just give me the word, honey. Just give me the word. But wise re-entry requires an equal amount of attention and discernment also to what you're bringing in, right? You could want a pastor who preaches expositionally, but are you going to follow it? You can want a fire worship team, but are you going to worship? You could want a fire kids ministry, but are you going to volunteer? Oops. Did I say that out loud? But re-entry, what you're re-entering into matters, but what you bring with your re-entry, it also matters. Because here's the truth. You're not the same person who was hurt the first time. The wound, it changes us. It changed you. The isolation changed you. The years of doing faith alone changed you. And if you don't account for those changes, if you don't bring honest self-awareness into your re-entry, then you will import patterns into a new community that belong to an old wound. Let me name a few things that people bring into new communities after church hurt. They bring a hair trigger. That means you have a hypersensitivity to anything that resembles the dynamic that hurt you before. The pastor who leads with confidence reads as authoritarian. The community with the clear structure reads as controlling. It's understandable. But if the hair trigger is running everything, then you will exit that community that is actually healthy because something in them reminds you of something that wasn't. But then they also bring in walls that look like wisdom. The decision to not give yourself fully, to not trust quickly, to not invest deeply. Framed as discernment, but actually functioning as self-protection that never gets stood down. Because real discernment has a threshold. It pays attention, and then when the evidence warrants it, it opens. But walls that look like wisdom never open. They just simply get maintained. And then they bring an audit posture. So this is where they're evaluating the community instead of participating in it. You're watching everything with your clipboard. You're watching to see if it will fail before deciding whether to invest in it. But communities don't perform under audit. They form under participation. And the audit posture guarantees that you will never see what the community is actually capable of because you didn't give it anything to work with. Howard Thurman, in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, writes about the experience of people who have been systematically marginalized and wounded by institutions, and the particular kind of courage it takes to re-engage those institutions without either naive trust or complete withdrawal. There's a fine line between them. But what he argues is that the path forward requires what he calls a technique of survival, where there is not armor, not performance, but a grounded, rooted sense of self that can engage the world without being destroyed by it. And it's that groundedness, that's what wise re-entry requires, because you know who you are. You know what you've been through, and that knowledge is the foundation from which you re-engage. Not as a victim who's looking for safety, and not as a consumer looking for the right fit, but as a person with something to give, looking for people to give it to. And if I'm honest, I think my family is very much kind of in that kind of area. Because like I told you, since Pursuit Church, since we closed it, it's been really hard for us to re-engage in a church. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this episode, because I thought that it would also be kind of a penicillin for my heart as well. Because there are things that we can contribute and we're looking for the right place to give it to. But I also want to address something directly because I know that it's in this room with me and you. See, some of you who are thinking about re-entry are not thinking about going back to institutional church. You're thinking about going back to something smaller, a house church, a dinner table, a few families who meet on a Sunday afternoon, a community that exists outside the structure of a Sunday morning service. And I want to say clearly, as someone who wanted to start a house church, that is an absolutely legitimate form of the body of Christ. We talked about the early church in Acts 2 last week. They met in temple courts and in homes. The house church was not a primitive version that eventually grew into something real. It was the primary expression of what Christian community looked like. Paul's letters were written to house churches. The gatherings he described in 1 Corinthians and in Romans 16 and in Colossians, those were intimate, table-centered communities. And there is nothing second class, nothing at all second class about building belonging outside of the institutional structure. But what I want to challenge is the impulse to build something small as a way of staying safe. A community of 3 people where you control all the variables is not belonging. It is managed proximity. Real belonging requires enough people that you cannot manage all of them, enough diversity that someone in the room will challenge you, enough otherness that you are actually practicing the one another commands of the New Testament, rather than just enjoying the company of people who are exactly like you. Miroslav Volf, who is a Croatian theologian, he wrote this book called Exclusion and Embrace after living through the ethnic violence of the Balkan Wars. You can look it up. But he argues that genuine Christian community is not built around sameness. Hear me. It's built around the practice of embrace, the willingness to make space in yourself for the other, for the different, for the one who does not neatly fit into your category. He further writes that the will to embrace must precede any knowledge about the other. You've got to be willing to embrace them before you know them. You decide to make space before you know what will fill it. And I know that just gave some of y'all the itches. How am I supposed to open my heart to somebody that I don't know? Jesus did it. So it's possible for us to do it as well. And I recognize that it's a costly posture, but it is the posture of the gospel. And it is the only posture that produces the kind of community that can actually hold people and not simply use them. So what does all of this come down to practically? What does faithful, wise re-entry actually look like? So it looks like choosing a direction and staying long enough to find out what's there. Hebrews 10, 24 and 25 tells us to consider how to stir one another up toward love and good works, not neglecting to meet together. The writer uses the word consider deliberately. It's not passive attendance. It is active, intentional, thoughtful engagement with the community. You think about how to contribute. You show up with something to give, not just something to receive. It looks like bringing your whole self in incrementally, not all at once. You're not performing openness that you don't actually feel, but you're choosing one person in a new community to be honest with. One conversation where you say something true. One moment where you go first instead of waiting to see if it's safe, and then paying attention to what happens. Because real communities respond to honesty with more honesty, not trite Christianese statements. Communities that are not safe respond to it with management. That response tells you all you need to know. But it also looks like staying through the first disappointment because, brother, sister, there will be one. As long as there are human beings making up the church, making up these institutions, there are going to be disappointments. The person you trusted says something careless. The leader makes a decision that you disagree with. The community handles something in a way that reminds you of the old wound, and the instinct to run starts to roar. But stay. Not forever, and not at the cost of your well-being. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is through that first friction, stay. Because the first friction is the test, not of the community's perfection, but of whether real belonging is possible there. How a community handles conflict and disappointment is the truest measure of its health. You can't know that without staying through one. But it also looks like receiving. Christine Pohl, in Making Room, argues that one of the most spiritually formative practices available to the believer is not just offering hospitality, but receiving it. Letting yourself be served. Letting someone else carry something for you. Letting the community give you what you came looking for. For people who have been hurt, receiving is often harder than giving. Giving keeps you in control, but receiving requires trust. And I know there are a lot of you out there who will give, but you won't receive. Paul writes in Romans 15:7, accept one another then, just as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God. The word accept here is the Greek word I'm going to butcher this, proslambano, to take to oneself, to welcome, to receive into one's fellowship. It is a mutual exchange. It runs in both directions. So you cannot experience the full reality of that verse from only being the giver. You also have to be the receiver. It has to work in both ways. And basically what that's saying is, family, you've got to let people in. Not all at once, not naively, not without discernment, but you must let people in. And I want to close the teaching section of this episode with a text that I have started to come back to more times than I can count. It's from Ecclesiastes 4, verses 9 through 12. It says this, 2 are better than 1. Because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. See, the teacher is not writing theology here in a systematic sense. He's writing observation. He has watched human life long enough to know something true about it. And that truth is that we are not built for alone. This is not a platitude. This is a structural reality. The person who falls alone has no one to help them up. The person who goes to sleep alone has no one to keep them warm. The person who goes to fight alone has no one to watch their back and can be overpowered. And then the image that closes it is that a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. This cord of 3 strands are 2 people woven together with God in the center. That is the cord that is not quickly broken, not easily broken. Not without some real force applied to something that was built to resist it. That's what you're trying to build. Not a perfect community, not a community that never disappoints you, not a community where you never have to risk anything, but a cord. Something woven together with other imperfect people with the presence of God as the through line in the center that is strong enough to hold everything together even when the pressure comes. That is worth building. That is worth the risk of reentry. And if I'm honest, man, I'm still building. I want you to know that because I haven't arrived on the other side of this conversation. I'm not writing from a place of completion, right? Like I said earlier, we've spent the time since May 2025 of figuring out what God is doing in our hearts and where he wants us to plant so that he can do it. And it's been a time of understanding and just trying to carefully and honestly kind of find our way back to insert into a community. And so I can say this, that it's not fast and it's not clean. You know, there have been moments in church where I feel like I'm auditing everything. There have been moments in church where I'm looking around with suspicion, right? But we're still trying. And that's what I'm asking you to do, is to keep trying. Because what I believe is on the other side of staying is not a perfect community. It's something better than that. It is a few people who know the real version of us, who have seen us in our worst moments, and they've stayed anyway. Because that's the chord. It's not large or impressive. It would not make a compelling church website, but it's something that holds. And we are to the point where we want to allow it to truly take hold. So here's where we are at the end of the belonging arc. Episode 31, the wound is real. Name it honestly. Grieve it fully, but don't let it become your entire worldview. Episode 32, community is proximity. Belonging is presence and partnership. And belonging cannot be received. It can only be built at cost over time by people willing to participate instead of simply consume. In episode 33, what we're saying today is that reentry is possible. Wise reentry looks like Naomi, walking back in with honesty, not management. It brings self-awareness about what the wound has done. It chooses a direction and stays long enough to find out what's there. And it receives as much as it gives. You're not looking for the perfect community. You're looking for a chord, a few people woven together with God in the center, strong enough to hold. It exists. You may have to build it. You may have to go first. You may have to stay through the first disappointment and the second and the third, but the chord is worth building. So go. Try again, differently this time, honestly this time, with your whole self offered incrementally to the right people in the right direction. Keep pursuing that. Father, I'm coming to you on behalf of everyone who just listened to all 3 of these episodes and is still standing at the edge of a door they're afraid to walk through. For the one whose last re-entry cost them something they're still recovering from, God, I ask you to restore what the years have taken, not by erasing the wound, but by building something in them that is stronger than what was broken. Give them the courage of Naomi. Let them walk back in honest and watch what you do with that honesty. For the one who is carrying their hair trigger, who interprets every imperfect leader as the pastor who hurt them, every clear structure as a system that controlled them, Lord, I ask for discernment that is very specific, not general. Help them see what is actually in front of them rather than what the wound has taught them to expect. For the one who has been auditing communities for years and never participating in them, God, interrupt that posture. Let them feel the cost of it, and let that cost become the thing that finally moves them from the outside to the inside. For the one who is building something small and calling it community because it's safe, God, I pray that you will expand their table. Bring them the one person who doesn't fit into their neat category. Bring them the difference that produces formation. Bring them the otherness that teaches them to embrace. And finally, God, for the one that is tired, who has tried and been hurt and tried and been hurt and tried and been hurt, and is just not sure that they have another try in them, Father, be what you were to Elijah. Let them rest, feed them, and then ask the question gently, in your timing, what are you doing here? Because you have not called them to end here. You have called them to the cord. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, before you go, I just need another minute. This arc took 3 episodes to build. If it met you somewhere real, if episode 31 named the wound, if episode 32 gave you language for what you've been missing, and if this episode 33, gave you something to walk toward, please share it. Share all 3, please. Send them to the person in your life who is standing at the edge of the door they're afraid to walk through. They need this conversation. And if Faith Formed has been worth your time, take 60 seconds and leave a rating and a review. 5 stars, please, wherever you listen. That one action is how the people who need this content and these conversations are able to find what they're looking for. Every review is someone else finding the arc. Also, subscribe so that you don't miss what's coming next. Follow Faith Formed on social media, Instagram, TikTok. The conversation keeps going between episodes. I'm your host, Justin, and this has been Faith Formed. I'll see you next week. Be blessed.